Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcus Heyman, and I'm an associate partner at Dalberg Advisors. And we're thrilled to be co-convening this webinar with Common Future this afternoon. Before turning it over to Crystal Hayling, Executive Director of the Libra Foundation and our moderator for this wonderful panel, I wanted to provide a quick introduction of Dalberg and Common Future and speak a bit about why we thought this conversation was so timely and essential. And we've had over 900 people register for this webinar, so it's clearly a topic that's of interest to many of you. For those who aren't familiar with our organizations, Dalberg is a social impact advisory firm, and we work with a range of partners, including foundations, nonprofits, and state and city government on topics including workers' rights, gender, education, health, among others. And I have the pleasure of co-leading our work focused on justice, equity, and economic mobility in the US. Common Future, our partner in this webinar, works alongside a network of frontline leaders, funders, and investors to support community-driven economic solutions. Common Future believes in creating power, choice, and ownership within all communities. And its work is centered around connecting wealth holders and decision makers with community wealth builders. So as you may have seen, today's webinar is the second in our Shaping an Equitable Future in the US series. And as Common Future and Dalberg, as we reflected on the conversation we wanted to have, we thought it was essential to reflect on the role that the social sector plays in actively contributing to an equitable future, or conversely, in preventing one, by upholding white supremacy and clinging on to power. While today's conversation focuses on funders and what they can do to shift power to help achieve racial justice, we know this issue is not unique to philanthropy. We know that it manifests in nonprofits, in research institutions, in advisory firms, including my own, and across the broader social impact ecosystem in terms of which ideas are upheld and celebrated, the composition of our leadership and boards, our decision-making processes, and the extent to which many are expected to conform to a single model developed and perpetuated by a privileged few. And these are just a few of the topics that we're really excited to dig into today once the panelists and the moderator move forward. So I'll conclude by just mentioning two things. First, the webinar will be recorded and shared with all of you who registered. And secondly, today's conversation will focus on what funders need to do to shift power, but it will form the basis for a second conversation in August, which will really focus on how funders can do so. So with that, on behalf of Dalberg and Common Future, we thank you very much for joining us, and I will turn it over to Crystal to take us forward.
Welcome, everyone. It's terrific to be here with you today, and I'm really excited to dig into this conversation because this is the stuff we need to be talking about. Thank you so much, Marcus and Rodney, for inviting this conversation, for opening it up, for inviting me to help moderate. I did say that I'm not really moderating these amazing folks. I'm kind of unleashing their brilliance, and so I'm really looking forward to that. And today, who are the folks that we have with us? We have an amazing panelist. Edgar Villanueva, who really actually needs no introduction for everyone here. He is the author of the incredible book, Decolonizing Wealth. He's the Senior Vice President of the Schott Foundation and is the founder of the Decolonizing Wealth Project. We also are lucky enough to have Vini Bhansali here with us today, who is the Executive Director of the Solidaire Network, which is a network of progressive donors in working deeply in conjunction and relationship with movement. And we also have Ming Francis here with us today, who has been doing some incredible research as an associate professor of political science at the University of Washington, and is also a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights at the Harvard Kennedy School. And one of the things we do know is that if we don't understand our own history, we are doomed to repeat it. And Megan has really been helping us to understand and uncover the history of philanthropy, the ways that we have been doing some good work and the ways in which we have actually broken some things and how not to make those mistakes again. So this conversation is really meant for us to start to have what we think of as an honest reckoning. And I hope that we can hear, I hope you'll hear some things today that make you uncomfortable. I hope you'll hear some things today that also really resonate with where you are in your space. With 900 people, we don't know exactly where everybody is on their journey, but we definitely think that this is a part of what this is creating community virtually in which we can all start to figure out where we are in our journey. I really want to start actually with just asking each of the panelists to give a little bit of their own background story. And I actually just want to start with one question for each of you. And I'll start with Edgar. Edgar, could you just tell us very briefly, kind of the thing that made you say yes to your first job in philanthropy? You know, what is it that you thought, oh, I'm going to be able to go do this. Why would I do this? And I'd actually like you to also share one thing that getting a job in philanthropy made you give up.
Wow, great question. You know, honestly, I think for me, I said yes because I thought I'm going to get paid that much to oversee that much money. And I had just come out of a graduate program where I was trained in healthcare administration, where I was feeling a little bit like a sellout. I didn't want to go into hospital administration, but I did care about health equity. And it was also the mission of the foundation, which the explicit mission was to improve the health of low-income people across North Carolina. And so that was exactly the calling that I felt aligned with. I think what I didn't know at the time and getting into the field, what I would be giving up was probably like a major part of who I was initially. I think we've come a long ways as a sector in terms of being more inclusive in our organizations. But at that time, we're talking 15 years ago, there was an extreme sort of forced assimilation as an outsider with lived experience, coming from poverty, coming from the community, being Native American, being gay, like all the things, coming into a very traditional old money foundation at that time. There were certain expectations imposed upon me that I felt like I had to align with. And over time, I began to sort of feel like that the very reason that I was hired was the thing that was hated or the thing that I had to hide in order to succeed in the sector. So I have been reclaiming my identity and celebrating who I am through the years. And I'm hopeful, and I want to believe that we've evolved since that time in our sector to be more inclusive. But I think the ideologies, as was stated at the frame of this call, this forced assimilation into certain blueprints and strategies, that type of thinking is still quite pervasive in our sector, and hopefully something that we can dismantle.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Edgar. Vini, I'm going to ask you the same questions, kind of, but with a little bit of a twist, which is to say, you know, you joined Solidaire, and as a member of Solidaire, I remember the joyous cry that went up when you accepted the position. But I also want to ask you, right, this is moving into working with a lot of donors, largely white donors with a lot of money. And it's a little bit of a thankless job. So I'm just curious, as you have a lot of movement experience, what would make you say yes to stepping into that kind of role, and what have you had to give up?
Thank you, Crystal. It's an honor to be in this company and to be in this conversation with people I so love and admire. I realized today that my very first philanthropy job was 20 years ago when I got tapped to run at age 25, a $25 million digital divide and telecommunications infrastructure fund for the state of Texas. Talk about having all your assumptions as a fresh off the boat kid from India, learning to adapt to the United States, still trying to figure out how to renew your visa and stay on good, and at the same time being responsible for traveling through rural and remote parts of Texas, supporting the building of infrastructure that would really, truly, from its root causes, address the digital divide. And so that was my very first job, and it really taught me how to connect to people's humanity. I would find myself in some communities where they had never seen a person like me roll through with a check ever. Sometimes I was sent to go get coffee for my traveling companion, the late Richard Brown, who would always joke and tell people, you might want to look at who signed that check before you send her to get the coffee. Those kinds of things happen. I have a whole other cocktail hour about my Texas stories, but it taught me something about the need for investing in community infrastructure, and what innovative and transformative solutions lie from the ground up that we can all learn from. Solidaire has actually been a huge experience for me. I've only been there 20 months. And it is the first time in my life that I'm working with a community of organizers that are so seriously committed to racial justice, that have a clear analysis, even as mostly white donors, about their particular role in undermining white supremacy, right-wing ideology, and also to ensure that the commitments for Black and Indigenous-led work are for a generation. And so that's what keeps me excited, thrilled, moving, changing, looking inwards, building a team and building a community of people in this network that are truly, truly in this work for our collective liberation.
Thank you so much. And Megan, you know, you are in philanthropy in a very different way than the rest of us. You are studying our history, you're doing research and analysis, you are uncovering files that people probably have never looked at before. And I'm just really curious because by and large, philanthropy has fan clubs, right? You know, we have journals that talk about what we do well, that hail all the new announcements, and writing that is critical, that actually develops an analysis about our role in social change is not that common. So I'm just curious what drew you to that. But then also, you know, in the field of philanthropic studies, if I may say that there is such a thing, you know, are you the skunk at the picnic, or like, how does that work? Tell me a little bit about what you had to give up to be in that branch of academia. What got you there, and what have you had to give up to be there?
Yeah, so I never imagined that I would be here. I'm a political scientist by training and a historian on the side. And I really, in terms of my interests, have always really been about Black political movements and how do Black actors on the margins actually shift political and legal institutions in our society. So within political science, it's Black politics and social movements. And so I wrote this book about the NAACP's campaign against racial violence in the first quarter of the 20th century, because I thought this was this really fascinating campaign about the NAACP for the first 2 decades of the organization's existence was only interested really in terms of the top main concern was racial violence, mob violence, and lynchings by actors of the state and by white vigilantes. And they really believed that kind of protection from violence was the first civil right. And so I told this story. But then I presented this story in many academic departments and in talks, and people would always ask, well, then why do we understand the NAACP as focused on education and giving us Brown v. Board and voting rights? Like, we believe you're a historical work, but this doesn't seem to be a story that we've heard before. And I actually did not have a good answer for 2 years. I went back to my archives, and then I saw the name on one scrap piece of paper, the Garland Fund. And for those who know the legal history of Brown v. Board, the Garland Fund is going to bankroll all of basically the education desegregation litigation between about 1931 and 1954. And I'm like, why is the Garland Fund in my period? And so I basically, what I did is I compared the NAACP archives for about a 10-year period and the Garland Fund archives for another 10-year period, because I just was trying to understand the role of the funder here. And so basically what I was able to figure out here was that in terms of to understand the NAACP's shift in terms of its agenda, as well as its organization strategies from racial violence to the area of education needs to understand the Garland Fund's influence on the NAACP in this earlier period. If I could just say one more thing about it that I think is really interesting here, is that the NAACP in the first 2 decades had very little money. Right now we think of them as an established organization, but back in the day, they were considered as radical, and they could barely keep the lights on. They had no big funders. And so they thought that education was important. It just wasn't their top concern, right? And so what we know, and I think what's also important to say about the Garland Fund is that they were a group of radical white funders. The most radical of the white funders in New York City at the time in the 1920s. And yet even they did not mean to shift the NAACP's priorities, but they did shift. And it's, I think, an important story to tell because this campaign has lived on in liberal philanthropy as an example of the change that funders can actually have. And it's part of the reason why so many left funders focus on education. Not that education is not radical, education is radical, but I think that this story is important in understanding Black radical visions about how rights are actually achieved, and the role of even well-meaning and well-intentioned funders in this. So, did not expect to be here,
Thank you.
but I'm here.
Well, we're really glad you're here, and you're uncovering our history in a way that many of us never really understood. And it really gets to the heart of the fact that I think so many of us believe in philanthropy, that as long as our intentions are good, our actions will be too. And so here you've set up for us a moment in time in which state-sponsored and rogue violence against Black bodies is an overwhelming reality that more and more people are becoming aware of. We have lots of fledgling organizations like the NAACP at that time who are beginning to do more work in this area and are calling for the right not to be terrorized by violence. And we have white funders who are woke, who are excited to be funding this work and who come in to do the right thing. Vini, I gotta say, there's some parallels right now. So I would love to know, leading an organization of some of the most woke funders we know, what are you having to do differently to make sure that this is not a cycle that gets repeated again?
Oof. Crystal with the juicy questions. I love it. So, you know, one of the ways in which Solidaire in particular is set up to respond to this moment is that we believe in the power of social movements. We believe in groups of organized people contesting for real power over generations. We also know that philanthropy has chronically disinvested from Black, Indigenous, immigrant communities and moved way too slow. So there's a role to be played in terms of organizing wealth, moving funding quickly, responsively, listening deeply, as your recent article invited us all to continue to do, and actually acting in real time, as the movement has been reminding us, funding for the movement to win, fund as if we really wish for it to win. And this vision of radical giving that invites our donor members to transform ourselves and our relationship to power and wealth. So we are no longer just talking about hoarding power, but redistributing wealth. We're talking about a deep redistribution of all forms of power and resources. We're talking about actually committing to a radical transformation of our economic, political, and cultural systems that entrench racial injustice. And also that by getting behind Black and Indigenous-led movement building, that it actually leads to all of us being free. And so, you know, one of the things that I'm listening to and watching really carefully happen in our membership, and I'll speak more to it, is that people are becoming also really clear that we don't give out of charity or paternalism. That's not the right role of donors in this moment. The only people we save are ourselves by doing our part. to make amends for the generations of oppression and theft and exploitation upon which the current economic system has been built. So through all the vehicles, through collaborations, through challenging our practices to go into silos or self-promotion, but instead in collaboration with an ecosystem of other philanthropic players, being deeply responsive to the ask from movement and being led by what our movement leaders are telling us.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you so much. Edgar, you are at a foundation. You are putting together a fund of people who are working on, deeply working on racial justice issues. And when we talk about power, how are you helping them to understand what it means to give up power? Like in the situation that you're in right now, you have talked a lot about money as medicine. How does that square with the idea of sharing power? And talk a little bit about what you mean by money as medicine.
Yeah, so Schott Foundation is an interesting case study where we originated as a private family foundation. Over the years, they decided as a family to basically hand the foundation over to the community. We converted to become a C3 public entity. The family brought on non-family to the board, and present day we have no family on the board. So we've evolved to be really just a philanthropic intermediary that is moving money to the community, kind of springboarding from that family's initial investment. And so it's definitely one model where wealthy white folks completely surrendered the power to the community. And I think their beliefs about the sharing of power from day one has been manifested in the type of grants that we support. 100% Black and Brown led, organizing in communities, the building of power. It's a frame that, the sharing of power or the giving up of power is just a frame that is, or a lens that's applied to everything that we do at Schott. So, I think it's interesting, in some ways, as an intermediary and having to be both a grant maker and a fundraiser at Schott. I have these conversations and I feel that tension on a regular basis. And even me, Edgar, who is known to be, someone who sort of pushes the sector on some of these issues, it's really, it does constantly sort of feel like a push and pull. Well-meaning funders in this moment, especially who are wanting to respond, I think are grappling and struggling with how do I actually show up and support and help in this moment, but I'm still kind of locked into needing to make it fit into this box, or to, or I have to impose on you language to call the work that the movement's doing this thing, and can you help me make it this thing? And so I do think that ultimately, we have to get to a place in the sector where we understand the power that we have and we liberate ourselves. I've worked in foundations where we were very prescriptive. We, kind of imposed language on folks. We were, funded programs where we got into how much are you paying this person and how many widgets of this are going to be produced because of this dollar, right? That was so much work on us that I don't even want to do that anymore, right? So there's something liberating ourselves to the point where we get out of our own way and just get into a relationship of trust with the community and let those resources flow. We can never make it make sense when we're trying to do grant making in any other way. We're fooling ourselves. We are, I think potentially harming more than we're doing good. The idea of using money as medicine is to really an invitation to the sector to understand that the history of wealth accumulation in this country has left a trail of trauma. Wealth was extracted from communities of color. Our economy was built off of slavery and genocide and land extraction. And so we as philanthropists, or anyone who has wealth, has to come to terms with that fact that wealth means trauma for a lot of folks. We have an opportunity to flip that paradigm and to think about using money differently. Using money as medicine is actually understanding that what has harmed communities can be repaired at some level. We can't undo exactly everything that's been done, but we can begin to help repair and restore by putting money where the hurt is the worst, and the hurt is the worst in communities of color.
It's so beautiful. Thank you so much. And it's such a revolutionary concept that you have shared with us. And I have to say, just personally, and I know in our institution, it's incredibly powerful, because I think you're exactly right. This idea that there is repair that can be done. And that's really what the purpose of this money is in that sense. Megan, I want to come back to you and ask a question, because one of the interesting things that you also talk about in your analysis around political science is we've got these institutions, and we're all trying to figure out how to be honest, truthful human beings in these systems. But I also kind of think it's worth it for us to ask someone like you, are these systems capable of being fixed? Is the nonprofit unit and the foundation unit, are these things that we can actually make to work for social justice when they weren't actually created for social justice? Give us a little bit of critique about these institutions and what we might need to do there in about 2 minutes.
We're coming in with these hot questions here. This is obviously an incredibly important question, right? And so one of the things that especially has been top of mind over the last 2 months in this, especially Black Lives Matter moment and movement here, right, is this question about not just in terms of repair, reform around policing and a criminal punishment system, but also in terms of the institutions that I actually are in all the time, right? So I think a lot about academic institutions, universities, and obviously part of my research is about these nonprofit institutions and can they be made better? Can they do the work of the movement, even if they were not actually meant to do the work of the movement? I'm not sure. And I know that answer probably is going to dissatisfy if any of my students are on this webinar, because they're like, Professor Francis, burn it all down, right? We should not have this. It should not exist. And part of that critique, I'm with them, right? I get it. I'm there. But I also think that there is room to shift institutions and structures within the system that we actually have right now. I think actually a lot about what I think about the possibilities of reform inside of nonprofit institutions is actually informed by the work around abolition and actually policing and the criminal punishment system. So I am an abolitionist. I'm happy to talk more about that later. I wasn't always there, but part of the work in terms of abolition, it's not that I'm going to wake up tomorrow and we're not going to have policing and we're not going to have prisons and jails, right? But it's about in terms of working towards those types of policy solutions and those types of programs, right, that will lead to a reduction in policing, that will lead to a reduction and a stopping, right, of the building of prisons and jails. And so it's how do we make that system smaller? So I do think, if we're talking about foundations, that needs to be made smaller, that all the foundations that exist right now do not need to exist and shouldn't exist. And I also very strongly believe that the leadership of a lot of these nonprofits, if they are actually interested in doing this type of work, to racial justice, social justice type of work, need to change. Like you can't say I'm going to commit to and I believe that Black Lives Matter, right? And you don't got Black people in leadership positions. You don't got Indigenous, you don't got Asian Americans in leadership positions. It doesn't work, right? You can't in terms of like have a kinder, gentler capitalism, right? Like there are some things that should not exist if we want a new type of system, if we are actually committed to this. Otherwise, we just need to like call a spade and say that we actually are not interested in type of revolutionary reform for people of color and marginalized people to live like equitable lives, right? That actually what we want is to maintain our positions and we just want life to be a little bit better on the margins for some people. So that's right.
Thank you. Vinny, I would love to hear where you go with this, with, again, talking to donors, right? And for some of the folks too, you can also translate. There's people out there who are sitting there and they're thinking, I cannot say that to my board. I cannot say that. You, I'm sure, have had, because I know I've been in some of these donor groups where people were like, well, listen, I get it what you're trying to say, but you just can't say defund the police. And so they're trying to give the movement notes. They'll be like, okay, if you say it this way, then we can talk about it. Talk to me about how you, Vini, are able to move some radical conversations and ideas with donors who were like, wait, I'm a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we have to build communities that are places of that kind of transformation to happen. It does not happen overnight. This is long haul work. And I say to so many women of color in philanthropy, not all of us need to be doing this. Some of us do need to sign up to do this, and not all of us need to be doing this, right? It is work that requires doing a level of internal interrogation, examination with our own feelings about power, privilege, money, wealth, organizing wealth, all of that. And unless we've done that work, working in philanthropy, you can just get easily tokenized. Edgar, you've written about it. We've all experienced it. And so that piece feels really important to name for myself, is that I have to approach this from a place of continuous healing and healed sense if I'm going to work with wealth to organize and transform it. The second piece for me that's really important is to model the behaviors we seek in others. So as this uprising moment happened, the movement for Black Lives that Solidaire has been a long-term partner with made an ask for raising $50 million. We made a commitment that within the summer we would move 5 million. Our members, because we made the channels of giving clear, because they have a political home inside of Solidaire, because we're constantly in this dialogue, because we're inviting people to come talk to them that really can explain the intricacies of the movement, moved and surpassed that goal. As of yesterday, 7.5 million have been moved and more in the works. Similarly, the Southern Power Fund came about of groups in the Deep South that are building a resistance infrastructure. They asked for $1 million. Our members responded, and then taking it further. So now that you've moved the resources, can you organize your own families? Some of our members have exemplified what it means to lean into this moment and have the hard conversations about slavery, about chronic Black disenfranchisement, about wealth built on the backs of Black people in their own families. And to do that deep, courageous work, communities like ours can provide scaffolding, a place to actually make some mistakes and experiment and learn together so that people are more effective. I'm also really proud that so much of our staff are organizers. So they have a general ethos of approaching working with donors as an organizing act. And then so many of our members in return are also donor organizers. So they also see this as a way of organizing their families, their communities. There are also very concrete actions to coalesce around right now. There was the ask for the emergency charity stimulus that invited people to double their own giving, and even before there is legislation, from 5% basic payout to 10. Most of our members have exceeded that and are at 20% payout and going further. They don't want the gold star for it. They're saying this is just the beginning. We have to look at our investments and our assets and put those in service of movement building and in reinvesting in community wealth. And so all of these are concrete examples of sort of coalescing around common vision, but also giving people very clear areas in which they can engage and learn. One of the last vehicles I'll mention is Solidaire's own Black Liberation Pooled Fund that is growing in leaps and bounds and was created really as a place, an entry place for foundations that previously knew nothing about funding racial justice, but are willing to learn, and donors who are reluctant to move at the level that the most experienced amongst us might be, but are willing in this moment to take one courageous next step, and hopefully that leads to long-term transformation.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And I can say too that one of the most powerful things, as you just said, is that there is a community of people who are walking this path. That, you know, a lot of times what stops people from doing this work is, I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to look like an asshole. Nobody wants me, you know, I'm going to, like, I don't want that, you know, and so people are afraid. But if you're in part of a community where you have that trust, you can make a mistake and somebody will say, made a mistake, and you move on from there. Edgar, I'm wondering if one of the things you can do is shed some light on for us, because part of this too is about having an analysis, right? Part of this is about understanding kind of how those of us with privilege see the world, and understanding that that's different than the actual real world, right? Privilege narrows our vision, right? It makes it harder for us to see all that is happening in the world. And I just wonder if you could talk, and you have done some really beautiful writing when we prepared for this. One of the things we were saying is that it's hard for people necessarily to connect the dots. There's a lot of people who think we're in this moment right now, and COVID was one thing, and the movement for Black Lives is another thing, right? And those are two different things, and they just, oh, it just so happens that they happen at the same time. But there is an analysis that helps us to understand what COVID has laid bare for us and how that connects to this moment in the movement for Black Lives, this moment after, what we have seen that none of us can unsee in terms of police violence. I'm wondering if you could just kind of give us a little bit of a walk about that analysis, because it is important for people to hear a difference in the way we see the world than perhaps they have seen it before. Would you be willing to do a little of that?
Yeah, I'll try. I feel like my colleagues could have maybe even do a better job than me. But, you know, I really appreciate you bringing that out, because of philanthropy, we have this tendency to just kind of respond quickly, sometimes to the headlines of the day. And we definitely felt that quick jerk in philanthropy where everything was about COVID. And because COVID was disproportionately impacting Indigenous communities, I got a lot of phone calls. We had an influx of donations to Decolonizing Wealth to support Native-led relief efforts. And then right around the corner, we had the lynching of George Floyd, which of course, the rest is history with the movement for Black Lives and all that work that's still going on, and philanthropy responding to that in some ways. And so it's really interesting, the questions, or I think the way that philanthropy has tried to put that into compartments and, you know, have conversations with me around, because our fund is at Decolonizing Wealth is called Liberated Capital. We fund Black-led power building, we fund Indigenous work. So people need to know, is this going into this pot or this pot? It really does require some analysis to understand that there is an underlying history that has led to communities being dehumanized, right, to be marginalized, disinvested in, that has made Black communities vulnerable and the subjects of violence, that have made Native communities especially vulnerable in this COVID moment. Poverty, I often say, because we're talking about money here, poverty is the product of public policy and theft that has been facilitated by white supremacy. And what I mean by that is that we have to understand that the underlying conditions of not having wealth, not having investment, and then the generations of intentional public policy that have continued to oppress Black communities, that have continued to oppress Indigenous communities, and then all of that, added on to the theft of the wealth that was extracted from our communities, and that's been facilitated by white supremacy. It's really to understand that it's all connected. And to be a funder asking questions that would potentially, pit Indigenous communities against Black communities is actually, I think, an act of white supremacy. And so we are in solidarity with the movement for Black Lives, the liberation that what I love about this moment is actually seeing my Indigenous brothers and sisters on the front line marching hand in hand with folks, and it's all interrelated, and it's about liberation. and freedom. And it's also about the freedom of white people, as has been brought up on this call. So we need to fund both and all of the above, right? We need to fund in an intersectional way. We need to get outside the boxes and the silos and the issues, and asking people to move pennies to this or that or the third, and just really trust the movement and fund in a holistic way. I think that another thing I just want to say, and kind of responding to that, is that I feel like this moment has put on display how philanthropy can actually behave and change and respond when we want to, right? So the foundations who have kind of put aside their process for the moment, I really want to acknowledge that and celebrate that for the funders who have done that. I've had significant investments that come in just from a quick phone call where I didn't have to fill out any paperwork. So we know that it's possible to move money and to respond when we really want to. And I hope that we can just find ways to continue to do that, to evolve our practice in philanthropy, to be less oppressive and to be more responsive and in alignment with the movement. We can do it. We've seen it happen in this moment. And so let's not go back to a way of doing grant making that is oppressive to communities.
I just would like to invite everybody, and our panelists, but everybody who's listening too, just kind of take a deep breath. That was a powerful thing to say. We can do this, right? We can do this. This is our work. This is why we got into this work. This is why we get up in the morning. This is why we're in community right now. So I just want to breathe that in, because sometimes this is hard, and just know that it's possible and we are moving in that direction. I want to share a quick story too, just building on that point about capital. A lot of times we think that this relationship between race and capital, as you mentioned, Edgar, is sort of ancient history. That repair work, and of course we know the word reparations comes from repair, is like so far ago. How could we ever have a conversation about that? And I just share a quick story about my own family. My father was a civil rights activist in Florida. And when my mom was pregnant with me, the Klan shot up our house, almost killing my mom, almost killing my two sisters, killing our family dog. And my mom just said, "I'm done. Okay, we're leaving this town. They've succeeded in running us out of town." And so we moved. My dad continued his civil rights work. My mom continued her civil rights work. But we moved from St. Augustine, Florida to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. My father had 3 young children. My parents had 3 young children. And my dad had to rebuild his dental practice in his mid-30s from scratch again. He managed to put 3 kids through college. But it's important I say that because I think for many people in this country, the idea that capital theft happened to Black people is something we think happened 400 years ago, right? I don't really have an inheritance. My parents were unable to help me buy a house for a reason, right? Because there was violence done upon our family that stole what we had invested into building. My dad had bought an office building in St. Augustine and had to leave without being able to sell it, right? So I just say that because I think when a lot of us come into philanthropy and we start not only talking about the grants, but we also want to interrogate the endowment, the capital, and have honest conversations about that as well. We're not just showing up there because of an intellectual idea. Many of us have also had personal experience to understand that we need to dig deeper into this conversation, and it's not just the 5%. So I would just like to put that story out here because I'd like to shift for a moment too and partly too that we're here with, you know, Rodney's incredible leadership at Common Future. And, you know, Megan, just if we could just pop into you for one quick second and just ask the question about what can you share with us that you've studied? And I know this may or may not be a big area of your study, but when you think about foundations and endowments, you know, kind of the 95% and not just the 5%, is there anything in your study that you would like to share with us that we should be, you know, questions we should be asking, conversations maybe we should be having? I don't know if your study has done that, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you.
Yeah, no, first, thank you so much for sharing that powerful story. I think that just really kind of grounds this discussion even more. So I very much appreciate that. In terms of thinking about endowments, my work doesn't specifically focus on them per se, the 95% and or the 5%, but what I do think a lot about is in terms of kind of the history of wealth accumulation in this country and the continuing, right, present moment, not perhaps yet history of that wealth accumulation. And one of the aspects I think that this moment also calls us to do, there's so many things that I think this moment calls for us, for those of us in the funder world and are working in the ecosystem, is to examine, especially for legacy institutions, is to examine about how wealth was actually created. I don't think that it's actually possible to do racial justice work today if you have not examined the ways in which your wealth has been created through kind of extraction of people of color and or the way in which it's harmed movements in the past, right? I find this fascinating. I've spoken at some of these places and I'm like, we can't do this work now if we have not examined the work that we've done in the past, right? I was raised on, if you know better, you do better. And if you don't know what you've done, how can you do better now, right? It's like maddening. So, and this is part of kind of the push in terms of in this country for reparations, right? We want this country to acknowledge significant wrong and significant wealth extraction, right? That is important, but yet we cannot ask that of so many legacy institutions in this country. And it's not just legacy institutions. So for those who like just 4 or 5 years ago, we're like, no, those as well, right? And this is in Edgar's book, right? Where is this money invested? Right? What is going on? And this is a lot of work of other people today in terms of wanting to be clear about, is this money like invested in oil? Is this money invested in prisons? How are we? It's not just about kind of the work that's on your beautiful webpage, right? But it's also, it is a reorientation, I think, completely. This moment is calling us to think about investments, investing, and that larger ecosystem of where our money is actually endowed. And for those who did not do like you did, Crystal, and go to your board and get the double increase, but that sought different types of investment solutions, we need to also ask very serious questions about where those different investment solutions actually are. And in part, this is the last thing I'll say, because I know you gave me a quick question on this and I've exceeded that already, but but also in terms of that philanthropy has so much power, right? And like that philanthropy in terms of should use that power to do good and to push people in investing institutions and financial institutions, which have hurt Black and brown people, to do better. And I just have not yet seen that at even a tiny bit of the scale that I want to see that at. So.
I love that because that is exactly what's called for right now. We need a big vision. Right? We need to not be thinking we can maybe get away with incremental, right? We need a big vision. Vini, you're just nodding. I'm not even going to ask you a question. Go.
Yes, a big vision and bold action to match our big vision. If after the COVID-19 pandemic and after this uprising that has revealed to us that the disproportionate impact on Black communities and Indigenous communities has been because of chronic disinvestment in public infrastructure in the United States. There's an entire system at play that we must begin to transform, have a strategic orientation and a timeline that takes us to 10, 20, 40, 50 years. Solidaire members humbled me last year. We came out with our theory of liberation and we said, we're going to commit to $1 billion to movement building in the next 10 years. And our members said, we think we can achieve that in 5. So then what? And what kind of infrastructure for power are we building, and how are we building that, and how are we investing in the things that actually are needed to transform? And the other thing that's on my heart that I must say is that while the US remains fundamentally unjust for our communities of color, for our Black communities in particular, because of the white supremacist extraction and ideologies that permeate all our institutions, we also have to examine American exceptionalism. What happens in the US affects the whole world, and what happens in the rest of the world, particularly in the global South, affects us right here in the United States. So constantly also internationalizing our efforts to build power and to ensure that we are funding in a way that we don't continue to perpetuate exceptionalism feels really important. But yes, I'm for the bold vision and I'm for the bold action. And I'm happy to say that there's a growing alignment of donors and funders that are ready to orient in that way.
Edgar, I'm going to turn things over to you too, and I really would love to hear sort of your thoughts about this vision, but also you've really talked a lot about this question of capital and interrogating its roots. So you go.
Yeah. It always happens this way in the last few minutes. Sometimes you start feeling that fire. I just want to underscore what Megan said. Like, everything that we need to know is in the past. We need to look back and remember our original instructions and learn our history, the error of our ways, and then begin to right those wrongs. I just want to say one thing about the endowment question. This is so important to me because, you know, as I said before, only about 8.5% of grants go to communities of color. I don't care if we double that, triple that, and 100% of grants started going to communities of color, and 100% of grants started being, deployed in the name of social justice. That would have tremendous impacts, I should say. But because we are sitting on so much capital, right, the $900 billion of philanthropic capital that we're sitting on, and in many ways, there's a neutral values approach or lens to that. I question the net value of philanthropy in general. If we are moving out capital into communities through grant making only 5% to do good, but we have 95% of our endowments invested in harmful and extractive industries, then we are canceling out the good and reversing the good that our grant making is trying to do. So I just want things to be, I want us to be who we say we are. And if we're about the life of equity, let's be about that life and call things what they are and be honest. I am calling on foundations to liberate the capital and to really think about digging deep into those endowments. Yes, increase the payout. Yes, give more. Even if it's temporary during this crisis, whatever you can do, but also to start having serious thoughts about what we can do to use those endowments beyond PRIs, beyond MRIs. I want to see foundations get really bold and begin to say, what would it mean to actually take off a significant piece of this endowment and like hand it over to communities of color? And I can't get into all the explanations around like, well, how does that happen? And who would get it? We could figure that out. But it's really getting to the place to be able to like imagine like these resources belong to community. That's what equity is about. Who do these resources belong to? Do they belong to you? Do they belong to your family? Or do they actually belong to community? Because if we can shift that that paradigm to really believe that equity, which is about ownership, that this money belongs to community, we will find ways to get it to community. What is happening in philanthropy is that we don't actually believe that. We say it all the time, but we don't believe it. And so we're holding on to the resources. We are just upside down in the way that we think about money in this sector. When I meet someone at a conference and the first question after my name is like, how big is your endowment? We are oriented to think about growing wealth and hoarding wealth and building large endowments. When I put something out to say that donor advised funds need to have mandated payouts and I have foundations coming for me because of that, then, which side are you on is what I want to say. We should be all celebrating and pushing for more resources to leave the coffers, to leave financial institutions, and to be invested in communities. And so that is really what it comes down to me, I want to push us all to think about responding in this moment. Yes, to do more grants that are targeted toward movement building and Black-led movement work, Indigenous-led movement work. But we can't hide from ever about those endowments, because I'm not going to stop talking about it. And the movement is coming for that money. Either the movement or the federal government's going to come for that money. So we need to get ahead of that and think about what we can do now to begin to share that capital, because that's where the real power is. And there's a way that it can happen. I've had foundations to actually approach me to say they're thinking through that. So it's not out of the world of possibility. But that is where I think we've got to go. We've got to think about deploying those resources and giving those resources back to communities in a way that is trust-based, no strings attached. But you know what? This is reparations right here. We're going to endow this Black-led philanthropic intermediary over here. We're going to put this money under the trust of Native Americans to be self-determined around how they want to run this. There are ways we can figure that out, and that would accomplish so many of the goals that we're talking about today.
Thank you so much. I think it is so powerful what you're talking about, because it really is also stepping into that belief that the people who are that people who have lived experience actually have the knowledge for how to move forward in society, how to build the society that we're all going to want to live in. And I think it's also one of the things that has been really beautiful about that we've talked about here is we're trying to free everybody, right? We can identify many specific things that philanthropy needs to give up. And a lot of those things that we couch as being positives in this society right now are actually giant burdens. You know, the expectation that we are experts in how to build a better world, and people keep looking at us and saying, well, maybe we can let go of that. We don't have to be the experts, right? We can actually, and expertise is very isolating. Extreme wealth is very isolating. Sitting in an ivory tower is very isolating. We have a crisis of fear in this country, and people want to be in community. We in philanthropy can begin to model that too. I really got to thank all of you. This has been an amazing conversation. And I feel so honored to be with you and so excited about what we're unleashing and the work that we're going to continue to accomplish together. And I'm going to turn this over to Rodney. Rodney, thanks for bringing us together. You always know the right thing to do.
Well, I'm so happy to be able to actually have participated in this conversation in terms of as actually an attendee, because getting to listen and learn from you all has been phenomenal for me. And just thank you so much for engaging in the conversation. And more importantly, doing the work that you do and really modeling and leading the way. You know, one of the things that I've been thinking about as you've all been sharing and speaking, and Crystal, your story was really important. And I want to share a quick story of my own. So my grandfather was a Purple Heart, fought in the Korean War. And he came back and was unable to have access to many of the benefits that should have been afforded to him, right? In the GI Bill. Now, I reflect on this because I was in conversation with a high net worth individual a couple of weeks ago who really looked at his own family's wealth and how that really began to originate. So white donor, how it really began to originate because of his family's ability to have wealth starting from the GI Bill, at least as far as he could. And so I think about that for people, to your point, Crystal, it's many of us do not understand, cannot contextualize. We see the data, but we can't actually connect it to the lived experiences, particularly in philanthropy, when we know the makeup of the leadership. And so you all are actually pretty outliers when we think about leaders in philanthropy, right? And I think something, Edgar, that you said when Crystal began the question with, what did you have to give up when you entered in philanthropy? And I began to actually think when you responded about your identity, I thought actually the space of philanthropy took that from you, right? Did not allow you. It's not something that you gave up, but something that was taken. And so I just really was reflecting on that and how often the institutions of philanthropy, unfortunately, continuously take, in the whole conversation that's been happening in terms of endowment and the real capital supremacy how that really has situated itself within philanthropy. We cannot have a conversation about racial injustice without talking about economic injustice. They're intertwined. And so we recognize that at Common Future. So Crystal, thank you for lifting it up. That is the work that we do. I also want to sort of speak a little bit about how, to these points, earlier in the year when COVID really was becoming online and people could really see the impacts it would have in communities, we made a decision to take 10% of our operating budget. And for a reminder, we're a relatively small not-for-profit. The reason why we decided to do that, take 10% of our operating budget to be able to actually produce a rapid response fund for our network, was because we also wanted to make a challenge to philanthropy, that this was the time to step up. And of course, institutions like Libra stepped up. And so I wanted to share that because we actually think, and Edgar, you talked about this, we're seeing how philanthropy is able to step up right now. Some philanthropy, not everyone. And it's all possible. And so we wanted to demonstrate that if we could do something like that, if Common Future could step into that kind of void, we really have an expectation that other philanthropies need to be able to step up into that void. And so when we try to connect these things, really principally we think about economic justice, we think about this intersection with racial economic justice. And so for the last few months, we've actually been able to, like Solidaire, mobilize some resources to our incredible network. And when you're talking about expertise, Crystal, the folks who are directly impacted by injustice, which most of our network is constituted of, they in fact have these brilliant ideas, and not just ideas, they've been putting them into practice for years, decades, right? They're not mainstream because we ignore consistently. And so we've been proud to be able to resource many of the things that are happening on our network. And people ask us, how are you able to do these things so quickly? How are you able to put resources in the hands of folks doing this work? Well, it's because, again, as Edgar and Vini were talking about, it's about trust, it's about relationship. It's probably not a mistake that the fact of, our organization is mostly people of color. That reflects back into some of the lived experiences and our ability to engage with certain communities that have been marginalized, extracted from. And so these are sort of the things that we think about at Common Future. And I'm so happy to have this conversation with you all, because you are some of the folks that we really see as modeling the way that if only philanthropic institutions would listen and follow your lead, we would be in a better place. I wanted to, before I hand it over to my colleague, this conversation about shifting power is really important. And the conversation about endowment is incredibly important for foundations that have them, because endowments are in fact a way of maintaining power. To Edgar's point, you could actually gift away some of your endowment. We've seen institutions do this. And so one of the principal things that we think about consistently and how we try to build our organization at Common Future is through trust, equity, and imagination. And that imagination being centered with those who are most directly impacted by injustice. And so we're really happy to be able to work with day in, day out. The reason why I get up every day is to be able to work with this phenomenal group of leaders who are in communities who have been impacted by these injustices, and yet continue to imagine something different and work to accrue power in service of doing something different. And so capital is really important. And so we do our work at Common Future really to be able to shift as much capital as we possibly can and influence others to do the same and give up power, because shifting capital, in fact, is about shifting power. I want to, again, mention our colleagues at Dalberg and really speak a little bit to the exciting partnership that we've been developing with them. Dalberg, like Common Future, is really trying to dig deeply into racial equity and justice, and is actively working to incorporate these principles in their justice, equity, and mobility practice. I want to point out that in addition to this webinar, we're currently working on a research and discovery project with Dalberg, which is really about surfacing the most bold ideas possible that we've seen in our Common Future network. So again, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, people of color working in rural communities, living across the US, really identifying the most powerful ideas that we're seeing in the network and really bubbling them up to challenge and disrupt the status quo. And so for those who have been listening to this phenomenal conversation, I wanted to speak about our next steps to move towards action. If you're a funder, we are planning on hosting a second session sometime in mid-August, where we're going to actually get a little bit deeper into tactics and strategies to help foundations along in your journey.